The night Damien Viscari saved a dying woman from a blizzard, he signed the death warrant for everything he'd spent 30 years building, and every enemy he'd ever made came to collect at once. If this is your first time here, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the end, because nothing about this night is what it appears to be. The blizzard came without warning, the way the worst things always do. 1 hour earlier, the sky above Blackridge had been the flat gray of old concrete, pressing down on the mountain range like something that had given up. By the time Damien Viscari's convoy cleared the last switchback out of Renhold Pass, the storm had swallowed the road whole. 3 black SUVs running tight formation, headlights cutting maybe 15 feet into a wall of moving white, the wind hitting the vehicles in irregular gusts that made the chassis shudder. Inside the lead car, nobody spoke. They'd learned not to, after a night like this one. Damien sat in the back seat with his jacket still buttoned and his hands resting loose on his thighs, the way a man sits when he's spent so much of his life in rooms where showing tension is the same as showing blood to something that hunts. He was 44 years old and looked it in the jaw and the eyes, the kind of face that earned its lines honestly. His knuckles had been split open 2 hours ago. He hadn't bothered wrapping them. The dried blood sat in the creases of his right hand like something he'd decided to keep. ETA, he said. Rennick, his driver, didn't look back. 22 minutes if this road doesn't get worse, 40 if it does. It'll get worse. Rennick didn't argue. He'd been driving for Damien for 11 years, and he'd learned to agree with statements like that because they were always right. In the third vehicle, 4 men were zip-tied to the seats. Representatives of 3 rival families, the Mortanis, the Garrett Collective, and what remained of the Oban Syndicate after Damien's people had spent the last 6 months quietly dismantling it from the outside in. Tonight had been what passed for diplomacy in the world Damien inhabited. 3 hours in a rented ski lodge 20 miles from any camera. The kind of meeting where nobody brought lawyers because lawyers created records and records created problems. What came out of it was simple. All 3 organizations would fold their eastern operations into Viscari territory. Their leadership would receive a percentage, a courtesy that amounted to breathing rights. Anyone who pushed back would be given a different kind of answer. 2 of the representatives had accepted. The third, a young Mortani nephew named Cillian, who'd arrived with a certain arrogant looseness in his shoulders, the confidence of someone who didn't fully believe the stories yet, had reached for a weapon that wasn't fast enough. The split knuckles on Damien's right hand were where that story ended. Cillian was in the third vehicle now, zip-tied with the rest of them, minus 2 teeth and whatever dignity he'd walked in with. Damien wasn't thinking about Cillian. He was thinking about what Lucien had said before the convoy left, standing in the snow outside the lodge with a cigarette burning down to his fingers and his coat open because Lucien Caro had never in 30 years shown physical discomfort the way other people did. The Mortani girl knows something, that's what he'd said. Not Cillian. The old man's been keeping a file. I think it goes back to your father. Damien had looked at him for a moment. What kind of file? Lucien had dropped the cigarette and ground it under his heel, the kind that doesn't exist until it very suddenly does. They hadn't said anything else about it. Lucien had climbed into the second vehicle, Damien into the first, and the convoy had moved out into a storm that was already becoming something else. Now, somewhere around the 40-minute mark of a 22-minute drive, Rennick hit the brakes hard enough that Damien's shoulder struck the window. What? Something on the road. Damien leaned forward. Through the windshield and the driving snow, the headlights picked up a shape at the road's shoulder, just beyond the guardrail at the edge of the tree line. Not an animal, the wrong dimensions for an animal. Drive around it. Rennick had already begun easing left when Damien said, "Stop." The SUV stopped. Rennick waited, engine idling, the wind making the vehicle rock in small, uneven intervals. Damien was already looking at the shape. It was a person. A woman, from what he could tell through the white noise of the storm. She was on her knees beside a low stone structure half buried in the snowdrift, an abandoned roadside chapel of some kind, the kind you found sometimes in the older parts of the mountains where people used to mark the road for travelers. She wasn't moving. Her coat was wrong for this weather, thin and dark, already sheeted with ice at the shoulders. Her hair was loose and plastered to her face. She'd been there long enough for the snow to begin covering her ankles. "She's gone," said one of the men in the front passenger seat. His name was Varlo, and he'd been with Damien for 6 years, and had the personality of someone who'd made peace early with bad outcomes. "She's not gone. She's going." Damien opened the door. "Boss?" "Stay in the car." He was already out. The wind hit him immediately, not cold so much as hostile, a thing with intent. He crossed the 12 feet to the guardrail in 4 steps and came around the front of the stone structure, crouching beside the woman. She was breathing. Barely. Her lips had the blue-gray tint of someone running out of time, and her hands, bare, no gloves, were curled in her lap at an angle that meant the fingers had gone beyond cold into something that wasn't numb, so much as absent. She wasn't conscious, but she wasn't gone, and when he pressed 2 fingers to her throat, he found a pulse that was thin and irregular but present. He looked at the chapel. The door was standing open. He looked at her coat again. The wrong coat for these mountains, for this weather, for any of this. No bag, no vehicle visible. The snow around her was disturbed, but not in a pattern that suggested she'd fallen. More like she'd walked here and simply run out of whatever had been moving her forward. Around her neck, barely visible against the dark coat, a chain. He didn't touch it. He picked her up. She weighed less than she should have. He carried her to the lead SUV, and Varlo had the back door open already. Not out of softness, but because he'd worked out that this was happening regardless of what he thought about it. "Move," Damien said. Varlo moved. Damien got in with the woman across his lap, pulled the door shut, and said to Rennick, "Drive, now, fast as you can make it." Nobody said anything about protocol. Nobody asked what the plan was for when they arrived at the estate with a half-dead stranger. Damien's people had learned over many years that questions like that got answered in sequence, not in advance. The convoy moved. Chetik. Her name, they would learn later, was Evelyn Mercer. But for the first 40 minutes, she was just a woman with blue lips and a pulse that the estate's physician, a compact older man named Grigor, who had learned medicine in circumstances he never discussed, described as concerning, not critical, with the careful language of someone who'd spent decades hedging. The estate sat high above the Blackridge Valley, accessible by a single private road that Damien's people controlled at 4 points. It was not the kind of place that appeared on maps or in conversation. 3 floors, 12 rooms that mattered, a basement that served purposes the upper floors didn't acknowledge. The kind of building that had seen things and kept them, the way old stone keeps temperature. Slowly, completely, without complaint. Evelyn was taken to one of the second-floor rooms. Grigor worked on her for 90 minutes, re-warming her by degrees the way you had to, not all at once or you traded one crisis for another. Damien stood outside the door for the first 20 minutes, then went to the east-facing study to handle the immediate aftermath of the evening. Calls to be made, the 3 representatives to be processed and released in the appropriate sequence, Cillian Mortani to be delivered to his uncle with a message about the teeth being recoverable if he sought prompt dental attention. Lucien arrived at the estate 20 minutes after the convoy. He came into the study without knocking, which was something only Lucien did. "She alive?" "Grigor thinks so." Lucien poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the sideboard without asking and stood by the window looking at the storm, which had intensified enough that the valley lights were gone. He was 51 years old, lean and gray at the temples, with the kind of face that people trusted instinctively and couldn't have explained why. He'd been Damien's consigliere for 17 years. Before that, he'd been his father Marco's. The Caro family had served the Viscaris in various capacities for longer than Damien had been alive. "Where'd she come from?" Lucien asked. "I don't know." "No vehicle. Nobody reported a breakdown on that road. Nobody called in a missing person tonight, I already checked." Lucien turned from the window. "So who walks up a mountain in a blizzard with no coat and no bag? Someone who didn't start the night planning to end up on the mountain. Or someone who was put there." Damien looked at him. "Say what you mean." "I mean the timing is interesting. Tonight of all nights, on that specific road, after what we just closed." Lucien set down the glass. "I don't trust interesting timing. I'll keep that in mind." "Damien, I heard you." He turned back to the papers on his desk. "Post 2 men on her door. Nobody in that room without my permission. When she wakes up, I talk to her first." Lucienne left without arguing, which was itself a kind of argument. Sab. She woke up at 4 in the morning. Damien was in the chair beside the window when Grigor came to find him in the study, and he was in the room beside her bed within 3 minutes. She was sitting up. She'd tried to sit up anyway, and made it about halfway before the physical reality of what her body had been through stopped her. Her hands were wrapped. Her color had come back, or some of it. She looked around the room with the particular focus of someone taking inventory of a situation they don't yet understand. He said nothing. Waited. She looked at him. He was standing by the door in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, jacket gone, the dried blood on his knuckles visible. He hadn't cleaned himself up. It hadn't occurred to him to, and even if it had, he wasn't sure he'd have bothered. "Where's this?" she said. Her voice was rough from the cold, deeper than he'd expected. "Somewhere safe." She processed that with the expression of someone who's learned that statements like "somewhere safe" tend to be conditional. "Who are you?" He told her his name. She looked at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that he couldn't immediately name. Not recognition, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something like the way a person looks when a word they've been trying to remember comes back to them. Then she blinked, and it was gone. "I don't know you," she said. "You were dying in the snow outside an old chapel off Renhold Pass. I brought you here." "Why?" The question was direct enough that it stopped him for a beat. Why? Because it was the right thing to do was not an answer he could deliver with a straight face, given the evening's prior proceedings. "Because you were dying and I stopped," which was not exactly an instinct he'd acted on before. He'd driven past worse. "I don't know," he said. She looked at him again with that measuring quality, the kind of attention that isn't passive. Her hands were in her lap. Around her neck he could see the chain. The locket was there, small and silver and old, with a dark stain at the clasp that wasn't from tonight. "There's something wrong with my memory," she said. It came out careful, not panicked, the careful way you'd describe a symptom to a doctor when you're not sure how serious it is. "I know my name, I know basic things, but before tonight—" She stopped. "What do you remember from before tonight?" She looked at the window. The storm was still going. The glass was dark and restless with it. "A road," she said finally. "Being cold. And a name." He waited. "Damien," she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Just the sound of the storm and the old building settling and the low background hum of the estate's generator, which ran independent of the grid. "You said my name," he said. Flat, not a question. "I said a name." She looked back at him. "I didn't know it was yours until you told me yours." He looked at the locket. She noticed him looking. "It was around my neck when I woke up," she said. "It was around your neck when I found you. I didn't take it. I know you didn't." She said it without explanation, and that absence of explanation was its own thing, a certainty she had that she couldn't account for. She seemed to notice it herself. "I don't know why I know that." Grigor appeared in the doorway and Damien stepped back, and the next 30 minutes were medical. Grigor checking her responses, asking her to track his finger, asking what year she thought it was, what her full name was. She answered clearly on some things and not at all on others, the gaps uneven and unpredictable. She remembered her name. She remembered reading a specific novel in a specific apartment with a window that faced east. She did not remember the past 2 weeks, or where she'd been, or how she'd come to be on a mountain road in a blizzard with the wrong coat and no identification, and a locket stained with blood she couldn't explain. When Grigor was done, she asked for water, and Damien had it brought. She sat with the glass in her wrapped hands and drank half of it, steady, careful. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm not going to sleep." "You almost died 3 hours ago." "I know that." She looked at the locket in her palm. She'd been turning it between her fingers without opening it. "What's your father's name?" He went very still. "What did you say?" She looked up. She had the expression of someone who just heard themselves say something unexpected. I don't know why I asked that. It just came out." "Why would you want to know my father's name?" "I don't know." He crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched to her eye level, which put them very close, and he looked at her the way he looked at things when he was deciding whether they were real or performance. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze with the kind of steadiness that's not about courage, exactly, more about having already been through something bad enough that a man crouching close in a strange room doesn't rank on the list. His name was Marco, Damien said. He died 25 years ago, and I have not told a single person that story in this room in a very long time, so if you know something about it, I need you to tell me right now, while you're telling the truth, before you decide what the smart play is. She looked at him. He could see her trying to get purchase on something, running her mind back along the path her memory had just taken, trying to find where the name had come from. He could watch it happening in her face, the real confusion of it. A study, she said slowly. Dark wood. A window with curtains, heavy curtains, dark red. A man sitting at a desk with his back turned. She paused. A little boy in the doorway. The man at the desk didn't know the boy was there. The breath Damien took was quiet and controlled, the kind you took when something hit you in the sternum and you refused to show it. The study she'd described. Dark wood, dark red curtains. A man at a desk with his back turned. He had stood in that doorway. He had been 8 years old. He had watched his father at that desk on a night he had never described to another living person. Not Lucienne, not anyone. The memory was the kind that stayed private, not because it was painful, but because it belonged to him alone. The last night he'd seen his father with any kind of normalcy, before the call came 2 days later, and the world reorganized itself around an absence. He stood up. He kept his face neutral by long practice. Sleep, he said. We'll talk again in the morning. He walked out and closed the door and stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand still on the doorknob and let the thing he'd just heard land in him fully, because if he didn't let it land now, he'd carry it wrong, and that always made things worse. She had described a memory that was his, a memory no photograph recorded and no other person had ever stood close enough to hold. He walked back to the study. Lucien was gone. The bourbon was on the sideboard where he'd left it. Damien sat down at the desk and looked at his split knuckles and the dried blood there and thought about a little boy in a doorway and a man at a desk who didn't know he was being watched, and he thought about a woman in the snow outside a chapel on a road that was probably the most isolated stretch of mountain in the county. And he thought about timing the way Lucien had taught him to think about it, always looking at what's underneath. He did not sleep. Morning came gray and continued gray. The storm had spent itself overnight and left 3 feet of new snow and a silence that sat on the mountain like something exhausted. Inside the estate, the routine continued the way it always did. Damien's organization did not pause for weather or for strange women appearing in second-floor rooms. There were 7 people on the property who handled operations, 4 on security rotation, and Grigor, who moved between his small medical room and the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd accepted that this was the life he had. Lucien arrived at 8, which meant he'd driven up in the aftermath of the storm and the road had still been passable, which meant he'd been impatient. He brought coffee and the morning's communications and sat across from Damien in the study with the easy authority of a man who'd been in this specific chair many hundreds of times and considered it partially his. She awake? He asked. Since 6. You talked to her again? Grigor did. I haven't. Lucien set the coffee down carefully. I need to tell you something. Damien waited. Last night, after I left you, I made some calls. He turned the coffee cup a quarter turn. The name Evelyn Mercer. I ran it. I didn't ask you to. No, you didn't. He met Damien's eyes. You were going to eventually. I did it early. And there's an Evelyn Mercer, 36 years old, no criminal record, no civil record of much consequence. Lived in 4 cities in the past decade. Works as a research archivist. He paused. But the interesting part isn't her. The interesting part is her parentage. Damien said nothing. Lucien reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a single folded sheet, unfolded it, and placed it on the desk face up. Damien looked at it. A name. A photograph. A connection drawn in Lucien's precise notation. He sat very still. The name on the sheet was Franklin Mercer, federal prosecutor, deceased. The man who, 22 years ago, had come within two witnesses of dismantling the entire Viscari Empire in a case that had ultimately collapsed when those witnesses recanted within 48 hours of each other under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. Franklin Mercer's case had failed. Franklin Mercer had subsequently died, Berkiskatsa ruled a cardiac event, inside 18 months of the case's collapse. Damien had been 22 when that case was active. He'd watched his uncle navigate it. He'd watched Lucien manage it from behind. He'd understood even then that whatever happened to those witnesses had not been an accident of conscience. "She's his daughter," Damien said, "hidden. The mother moved her out of the picture before the trial, changed names, changed location, evidently did a thorough job of it because nobody connected them at the time." Lucien retrieved the sheet, which raises the question of how she ends up on our road on our night after all this time. Is there a connection to Mortani, to any of the families? Not that I've found yet. But you're looking. I'm looking. Lucien folded the sheet again, precise along the original crease. I want to be clear, Damien, about what I'm saying. You haven't said anything yet. I'm saying she may not be here by accident. He held the folded sheet between two fingers. I'm saying the situation has dimensions we don't have a complete picture of yet. And I'm saying that in your position, with the convergence of this night and this woman and her particular name, I would want to understand before I extended trust. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Lucien was the most intelligent person Damien had ever been close to. He was also, by most reckonings, the reason the Viscari Empire had survived the last 20 years. His counsel had been correct more often than any single variable had a right to be, and in the world they inhabited, that kind of accuracy was the only currency that mattered. Keep looking, Damien said. I want everything you can get by tonight. Lucien stood, pocketed the sheet, picked up his coffee. And the woman? She stays. Damien? She stays until we know what we're looking at. He met the other man's eyes. Post another man on the door. I want the room across the hall watched at night. She doesn't go anywhere without two of our people in sight. Lucien studied him for a moment with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite calculation, that lived in the specific territory between them. She described something to me last night, Damien said. A room. A specific memory. She had no way to know it. Lucien's face shifted, very slightly. What kind of memory? Mine. He picked up his own coffee. That's the part I haven't worked out yet. Dish. He went to her room at 11. She was at the window when he came in, standing with her arms crossed, looking at the snow on the mountain face below. She'd been given clothes from a supply the estate kept, plain things, functional, and her hair was dry now and pulled back. The locket was around her neck again, outside the shirt this time where she could see it. She turned when she heard him. You found out who I am, she said. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat. Why do you think that? Because you didn't come back last night, and you didn't send anyone until this morning, and then you sent a doctor with specific questions and not a single one of them was casual. You were building a picture. She sat on the edge of the bed, facing him. What did you find? Your father's name was Franklin Mercer. She absorbed that without expression. You knew him. Not personally. I knew of him. He tried to prosecute your family. Yes. And he died. Yes. She looked at the locket, turned it once in her fingers without opening it. When I was 7, she said, my mother woke me up in the middle of the night and put me in a car with 2 bags and we drove for 11 hours. I fell asleep in one city and woke up in another, and she told me we were starting over and I never saw our old apartment again. She paused. I didn't know why until I was 17 and found a box of my father's things she'd been carrying for 10 years. Newspaper clippings, the trial documents, a photograph. You read the documents. I read everything. She looked at him now, direct. I know what your family did. I know what was done to those witnesses. I know my father was probably... She stopped. Restarted. I'm not here for revenge, if that's what you're deciding right now. I'm not connected to anyone. I don't have a plan. People with plans tend not to look the way you looked last night. Then what do you think I am? He considered the question honestly. I don't know. That's the problem. She nodded as if she'd expected that answer, and it was a reasonable one. Then she said, The memory I described to you last night, the study, the boy in the doorway. Yes. I've been trying since I woke up to understand where that came from. It's not my memory. I've never been in a room like that. She pulled the locket from the chain, held it out toward him. I think you should open this. He looked at it. Small, silver, old. The bloodstain at the clasp was dry and dark. He took it. The clasp was stiff but not stuck, and when he pressed it, it opened. Inside, 2 photographs pressed thin with age. On the left, a boy who could not have been more than 8 or 9, dark-haired, serious-faced, wearing a formal shirt, standing in what looked like the entry hall of a large house. On the right, the same boy, slightly older, sitting at the edge of what appeared to be a stone fountain in some kind of courtyard. Damien looked at the photographs for a long time. He had never seen these photographs before in his life, but the boy in them was him. He looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression that held something careful and something afraid in roughly equal measure, and she said, I woke up with that around my neck. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how I got to that road. I don't know whose blood is on the clasp. She paused. And until 30 seconds ago, I had no idea who was in those photographs. The estate was quiet around them. The mountain outside the window was white and absolute. Damien closed the locket, held it in his fist. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. Just the ordinary sound of the place going about its day. But Damien's head came up at it, a reflex his body had developed over a long career. The involuntary attention to sound in a space that was supposed to be controlled. He looked at the window. At the clean snow on the ledge outside it. A single set of footprints in the snow below, coming up to the wall from the tree line and stopping directly beneath this window. They had not been there 20 minutes ago. Damien was at the window in 4 steps. The footprints were fresh, the edges still crisp, the snow and the compression marks not yet settled into the flat blue-white that cold made of old tracks. Someone had come up from the tree line within the last 20 minutes, stood beneath this specific window, and gone back. The return tracks ran parallel to the incoming ones, same stride length, no hesitation. Not surveillance. Surveillance didn't advertise itself with a single approach and retreat. This was a message. He turned to Evelyn. Stay in this room. Do not open the door for anyone except Grigor. What? Do you understand me? She looked at the window, then at him. Whatever argument she'd been building, she set it down. Yes. He was out of the room in 10 seconds, moving down the corridor at the pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground fast and didn't announce itself. He hit the stairwell, came out at the ground level, pushed through the east-facing service door into the cold. The snow outside the door had been disturbed, not footprints, but the long, irregular scrape of something dragged. He followed it 12 feet to the woodpile beside the generator housing and stopped, one of his security men. Tallow. The one who'd been on the east rotation since 6 that morning. He was seated against the woodpile with his hands in his lap and his head tilted back at an angle that looked like sleep and wasn't. The entry wound was behind the left ear, something small caliber and close. The kind of work that was professional in the specific sense that it had been done without noise and without excess. Damien crouched, touched Tallow's wrist out of something that wasn't hope, confirmed what the angle of his head had already told him, and stood. He pulled out his phone, called Varlo. East side, he said when it connected. Tallow's down. Somebody came up from the tree line and walked back out. I need every man inside the perimeter counted right now, and I need the tree line covered from the north window. Do it quiet. He went back inside before Varlo could respond. Moritz. Lucien was in the study when Damien came back upstairs. He was at the window, the south-facing one, looking out at a different angle of mountain, and he turned when Damien came in, reading the temperature of the room immediately. Talk, Lucien said. Tallow's dead. Single shot, east side, sometime in the last 40 minutes. Damien went to the desk and opened the lower drawer and took out the weapon he kept there, checked it, holstered it at his side. The tree line shows one set of tracks in and out, not a crew. One person scouting for a crew that hasn't moved yet. Lucien was very still. Inside the perimeter. Through it. That landed. The estate's perimeter wasn't casual. It was the product of 11 years of incremental security work, cameras and motion sensors, and two-man rotation specifically designed to make a quiet approach from the tree line the kind of thing that didn't happen. "Who knew we were here last night?" Lucian asked. "The convoy, my people, you." "You're saying that out loud for a reason." "I'm saying it out loud because it's true." Damien looked at him steadily. "The route we took was decided 40 minutes before we left. Nobody external had it." Lucien set his coffee down on the window ledge. "Then it's one of ours. Or it's someone who had the route in advance." Damien held his gaze. "How long has this location been known to the Mortani family?" A pause. Brief, controlled, but there. "It's not in the formal record, but Cillian's uncle, the old man, he's been in the business long enough that there are things he knows that aren't written anywhere." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." Lucian turned back to the window. "You're going to tell me this is connected to the woman. Somebody walked up to the window of the room she's in. That's not coincidence I'm prepared to accept." "Agreed." He folded his arms. "Then either she's a target, or she's a signal, or she's a weapon being aimed at something we haven't identified yet." He turned back. "None of those options favor keeping her here. Moving her in the current situation is worse. Damien, if someone's already inside the perimeter, moving her is exactly what they want. It puts her in transit, which is exposure I can't control." He picked up his phone again. "We lock down the estate. Nobody in or out. I want Grigor moved to the second floor, and I want 2 men on Evelyn's door, not 1. And if the inside problem is one of those 2 men?" Damien looked at him. "Then pick the 2 men yourself. Your judgment." Lucien held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. The lockdown held through noon and past it. Damien's people moved through the estate with the particular tightened energy of professionals who understood that the situation had changed without yet knowing how. Nobody said much. In operations like this, conversation was the thing you cut first. Varlo confirmed the perimeter count. 12 men present and accounted for, including Tallow's body, which had been brought inside. The track pattern from the tree line suggested the shooter had come in from the north-northeast approach, which was the one blind spot in the camera coverage, not because it had been overlooked, but because the terrain made installation impractical, a long, rocky slope that the original security assessment had classified as low risk on account of the exposure involved. Someone had used that assessment against them, someone who'd read the assessment, or someone who'd written it. Damien sat with that thought and let it have its full weight. At 12:30, he went back to Evelyn's room. She was sitting on the floor against the wall beside the bed, which he hadn't expected. Not on the bed, not in the chair. On the floor, knees up, the locket in her hands, her eyes on the middle distance. She looked up when he came in, but didn't move. "What happened?" she said. "One of my men is dead." She absorbed that without visible shock, which told him something. Either she'd heard something through the walls, or she was better at controlling her reactions than most people. He suspected the latter. "Because of me," she said. "I don't know yet." "Someone was outside that window." "Yes." She turned the locket. "I've been trying to open it again. The right side, there's a second compartment. I felt it when you handed it back." She held it out to him. "I can't get the second catch." He crossed the room and took it from her. The locket was slightly thicker than it appeared at first. He'd registered that when he'd opened it before, but put it aside. He ran his thumb along the lower edge and felt it, a secondary seam, finer than the first, with a catch that was set flush into the silver. He pressed it with his thumbnail. The second compartment opened. Inside, a piece of paper folded so many times it was the size of a thumbnail, the folds sharp with age. He unfolded it carefully at the edge of the bed, spreading it against his knee. Numbers. A sequence of them, handwritten in a small, cramped hand. At the top of the paper, 2 words. Vault. Renhold. He read it twice. "Do you know what that is?" Evelyn asked from the floor. "No." Which was the truth? He did not know what those specific numbers meant, but he knew the word Renhold. Not the pass, but a disused facility on the far side of the mountain, part of a hydroelectric project that had been abandoned in the 1990s. He knew it the way you knew things that were connected to names you'd stopped saying aloud. His father had owned a share in the Renhold project. It had passed to his uncle in the estate. His uncle had held it for 6 years and then quietly sold it to a holding company whose name Damien had never looked into. He hadn't looked into it because Lucien had told him it was clean. He folded the paper back along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket. Evelyn was watching him. "You recognize something," she said. "Get up off the floor." "I'm fine on the floor." "Get up." He held a hand down to her. "I need you to be able to move fast if that becomes necessary, and you're going to be stiff if you stay like that." She looked at his hand, took it, and stood. She was close to his height. He'd registered that last night, but not fully, had been occupied with the color of her lips and the rate of her pulse. Standing now, she was maybe 3 inches shorter, which put her eyes at a level that was uncomfortably direct. She didn't step back. He didn't either. "What's on that paper?" she said. "Something I need to look into." "That's not an answer." "It's what you're getting right now." He released her hand. "I need to know something from you. The past 2 weeks, you said your memory of them is gone. Is there anything at the edges? Not events, impressions, feelings about where you were or who you were with." She thought about it the way a careful person thought. She didn't answer immediately. She actually went back through it, and he watched her do it. "Cold," she said. "Not like last night. Before that. Days of cold, and the feeling of reading, of going through documents." She paused. "Fear. Not sudden fear, the low kind. The kind that's been there long enough that you stop noticing it." Another pause. "A man's voice. I can't put a face to it, but the voice it was familiar, someone I'd heard before." "Threatening?" "Careful," she said. "The way someone's careful when they know what they're doing matters." He filed that and moved on. "The locket. Where did you get it originally? Before last night?" "I don't know. I've had it as long as I can remember. My mother gave it to me when I was young. She said it belonged to someone who wanted me to have it, and she never said more than that." "Your mother is dead?" 3 years ago. Flat. Not raw. The flatness of someone who's processed it and moved it to the place where it lives permanently. "Did your mother know my father?" The question landed differently than he'd expected. She went very still. "Why would she?" she said slowly. "Franklin Mercer prosecuted my family. Your mother moved you out of the picture before the trial. Someone gave you a locket with photographs of me as a child." He kept his voice even. "The connections aren't coincidental." She looked at the wall. He could see her working through it, not resisting it, which was what he'd half expected, but actually following the logic to where it went, which was a different kind of person than he'd initially taken her for. "My mother never talked about my father," she said. "Not the case. Not his death. Not any of it. I found the box by accident. She didn't know I found it, and I never told her." She turned back to him. "She was frightened for most of my childhood. I thought it was just the way she was. I didn't understand until later that it was specific." "Frightened of what?" "Of someone finding us." The door opened. "Varlo, no knock." "We've got a problem," Varlo said, and his voice had the texture it got when the problem was already in motion. "One of the Mortani vehicles just cleared the north checkpoint." Damien turned. "I said nobody in or out." "I know what you said." Varlo's jaw was set. "Checkpoint man let them through. Said he got a call from you directly." The air in the room changed. "I didn't call the checkpoint." "No," Varlo said. "You didn't." The Mortani vehicle was a gray sedan that had come up the mountain road and stopped in the estate's front court like it had an invitation. 2 men in the front, 1 in the back. They didn't get out. They sat in the running vehicle with their hands visible through the windshield, which was either professional courtesy or provocation. And in Damien's experience, those 2 things were often the same. Damien came out through the main entrance with Varlo on his left and 2 other men flanking. The cold hit immediately, clean and sharp. He walked to the front of the sedan and stopped 8 feet from the hood. The back door opened. A man got out who was not Cillian Mortani and not anyone from the previous night's meeting. He was 60 or so, heavy set in the way of someone who'd been physically powerful once, and carried the memory of it in his posture. His coat was good. His shoes were wrong for snow, which meant he hadn't planned on walking in it. "Mr. Viscari," he said, "I don't know you." "No." He stepped clear of the door. "But you know my family. I'm Aldous Mortani. Cillian is my nephew." Damien looked at him without expression. "He'll get his teeth back if he acts fast." "That's not why I'm here." Aldous Mortani's breath came in regular clouds. He wasn't nervous, or he was hiding it well enough that the difference didn't matter. "I'm here because of the woman." Damien didn't move. "I need you to understand something," Aldous said. "The woman you found on the road last night, her being here creates a problem that is not limited to your organization or mine. There are people, specific people, with specific interests in a specific piece of history, who know she exists. They've known since she started making inquiries, approximately 3 weeks ago. She was close to something. They moved to stop her." "Who moved?" "That's what I'm trying to tell you, if you'll let me." He glanced at the men flanking Damien. "Somewhere we can speak without an audience. You'll say what you came to say here, or you'll get back in that car." Aldous Mortani looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, showing the motion before he made it, and removed a small sealed envelope. He held it out. Damien didn't take it. Varlo did, stepping forward, checking the envelope's weight and shape before handing it back. Damien broke the seal. Inside, a photograph. Black and white, printed recently from what looked like an older source. The grain of it was analog, not digital. 2 men sitting at a table. The quality was poor, but the faces were legible. One of the men Damien didn't know. The other, he kept his face level. Behind the level surface of it, something moved that he couldn't have named precisely, a combination of recognition and a cold dropping sensation that started in his chest. The other man was Lucian Caro, 25 years younger, maybe 30 years old, but absolutely Lucian. The jaw, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he held himself in a chair. The man across from him in the photograph, whose face Damien didn't recognize, had a hand extended across the table. Lucien's hand was extended to meet it. Between their hands, the edge of something that might have been a folder or a document. The date stamp at the bottom of the photograph, 3 days before Marco Viscari died. Damien folded the photograph and put it in his pocket with the paper from the locket. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My father kept it," Aldous Mortani said. "He was given it 25 years ago by a man who told him it was insurance. My father never used it. He was cautious. He kept it because he understood what it meant." A pause. "When Cillian came home last night, I decided cautious had a shelf life." "What does it mean?" Aldous held his gaze. "It means the man you trust most has been in business with the people who killed your father since before your father died." He let that land. "And it means the woman in your house has been carrying the only hard evidence capable of proving it." The wind moved across the courtyard. One of Damien's men shifted his weight, and the snow under his boot compressed with a small, flat sound. "How do you know what she's carrying?" Damien said. "Because the people who put her on that road know. They put her there to die." Aldous Mortani buttoned his coat. "They didn't expect you to stop." He got back in the car. The gray sedan reversed out of the court and went back down the mountain road, and Damien stood in the cold watching it until it was gone. He did not go directly back inside. He stood in the court for 90 seconds with his hands at his sides and the photograph in his pocket, and thought about Lucienne, specifically about the 30 years of knowing someone, the specific texture of that knowledge, the 10,000 small acts of loyalty and competence and shared decision-making that built the thing you called trust. He thought about how that kind of architecture didn't fall with one photograph. It cracked. The falling was a process. He went back inside. Lucienne was in the hallway. That was the first thing that was wrong. Lucian should have been in the study or the security room. He'd been managing the lockdown communications. There was no practical reason for him to be standing in the main hallway with his phone in his hand, and Lucian was not a man who went anywhere without a practical reason. "Who was it?" Lucian said. "Aldous Mortani." Something crossed Lucian's face. The something was fast, practiced, covered immediately. But Damien had spent 30 years learning to read the specific face, and he caught it. Not surprise. The arrangement of a man hearing something he already knew arriving in the form he'd been anticipating. What did he want? Lucien said. To talk about history. Damien looked at him. He's going to be a problem. We can manage Aldous Mortani. I'm sure we can. Damien held his gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. Let the silence run a half beat past, comfortable. I'm going to check on the woman. He went upstairs. Mas. Evelyn was not in her room. The door was standing slightly open. Inside, the chair was pushed back from the window at an angle that meant someone had stood up from it quickly, and the window itself, the one with the footprints in the snow below it, was unlocked. It had been locked. Grigor had checked it twice. He was back in the corridor in 2 seconds. Varlo! Into the phone. Evelyn Mercer's room. Where is she? A beat of silence on the line that was 2 seconds too long. Then, she's... A pause with movement underneath it. The sound of someone turning, checking. She's not showing on the internal cameras. How? I don't... The East Wing cameras, they're looping. A longer pause, and in the pause the quality of Varlo's voice changed, the flat professionalism cracking slightly. They've been looping for 17 minutes, same 4-minute cycle. 17 minutes. Since approximately the time Damien had been in the court talking to Aldous Mortani. He ran. He took the stairs 2 at a time and hit the second-floor east corridor at a pace that stopped pretending not to be running, shoulder-checking the door of the stairwell access open, and came out into the service passage that ran parallel to the main east hall. Colder here, concrete, less heated than the main rooms. A window at the far end gave onto the side of the building where a narrow maintenance ledge ran to the fire stairs. The window was open 3 inches. The snow on the ledge beyond it showed a disturbance. Not footprints, not enough width for that, but a scrape and press pattern of someone who'd moved along the ledge flat to the wall. He went back to the main corridor, down to the ground floor exit, out the east door and around the corner of the building at a run, the snow deep enough to slow him, and came around to the fire stairs in time to see the figure at the base of them. Not Evelyn. A man he didn't recognize. Dark coat, cap pulled low, already moving toward the tree line at a pace that said he knew the ground. He had something under his left arm carried against his body. Damien drew and fired twice into the ground 10 feet ahead of the man, which stopped him. The man turned. He raised both hands, one of them empty, the other holding a manila envelope that he'd been carrying flat against his coat. Down, Damien said. On the ground. The man went down. His cap came off in the snow. He was young, 25, maybe less. He was shaking, and the shaking looked genuine. Where is she? Damien said, standing over him. I was just dropping. I'm just a courier. Damien crouched and took the envelope from him, sealed, his name on the outside in handwriting he didn't recognize. Who gave you this? A man, downtown Blackridge. I don't know who he is, What man? Describe him. The description was useless. Generic, frightened, the description of someone who hadn't looked carefully because they'd been paid not to. Damien stood. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the fire stairs and the ledge and the open window. Evelyn had not been taken through that window. Someone had opened it to make him think she had. And while he'd been running toward where she wasn't, a courier had been at the base of the fire stairs, and he turned and went back inside at a run, up the stairs, checking rooms as he went, and found her in the last place he should have needed to look. The study on the north side, sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace, knees together, hands in her lap, with the expression of someone who has just done something that scared her and has decided not to show that it scared her. I moved, she said before he could speak. The window in my room was unlocked. Someone unlocked it from outside. I could see the latch marks. I didn't know if the men on my door were safe, so I moved on my own. He looked at her for a moment. You picked a room and didn't tell anyone. I picked a room with 2 exits and a sight line to the main stairwell. She met his eyes. I wasn't hiding. I was repositioning. That's a meaningful distinction to you. Yes. She paused. What's in the envelope? He sat down across from her and broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet. Typed, not handwritten. 12 lines. He read it once, read it again. The paper described a specific meeting on a specific date, 25 years ago, in a specific location in Blackridge. The participants. The agreement reached. The terms of that agreement, which involved the elimination of Marco Vescari and the subsequent management of his son's organization through an intermediary whose role would be to steer the empire's decisions, manage its vulnerabilities, and ensure that certain information pertaining to the Renhold facility never reached anyone capable of acting on it. The intermediary was named Lucien Caro. The paper also described what was stored at the Renhold facility. What had been stored there for 25 years? The document that Marco Vescari had prepared, evidence of corruption involving 11 politicians, 4 federal prosecutors, and the leadership of 3 organized crime families. The document that would have dismantled every power structure in the region simultaneously, that would have been Marco's exit from the life he'd built, the leverage that would have bought him out and bought his family clean. The document Lucien had buried. The document Evelyn's father had spent his career trying to independently reconstruct from the outside, not knowing the original existed. The document the Locket's coordinates were pointing to. Damien set the paper down. Evelyn was watching him with the particular attention of someone who'd learned to read what people tried not to show. My father built an exit, Damien said. Not to her exactly, to the room, to the thing he was working out. He was going to use it, and someone took it from him before he could. What was in the locket? She asked. The numbers, the address. He looked at her. How did you know there were numbers? She opened her mouth, closed it. Her hand came up to the locket at her throat. I don't know, she said quietly. I just knew. He stood. The door opened before he reached it. Lucien stepped into the room. He looked at Damien. He looked at the paper on the table. He looked at Evelyn. His face completed its quick private calculation in the space of half a second, and Damien watched it happen and understood in that moment, with the completeness that comes from knowing a person for 30 years, that Lucien already knew what was on the paper. He had probably known for the last 24 hours that it existed. Damien, Lucien said, and his voice had the particular careful register of a man who is deciding how much longer to maintain a position. Don't, Damien said. Lucien looked at him, and the lights went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Not a power failure. The generator should have caught anything the grid dropped within 2 seconds. This was intentional, which meant someone had gone to the generator housing and done something deliberate to it, and that meant the perimeter was not holding, and that meant everything Damien had built in the last 18 hours to contain this situation had just been taken apart from underneath. The emergency lights came on at the 4-second mark. Low, red-tinted, mounted at floor level along the corridor outside the study. They gave the room the quality of something that was on fire from the ground up. In that light, Lucien moved, not toward Damien, toward Evelyn. He crossed the room in 3 steps and had her arm before Damien fully processed the direction of the move, and by the time Damien had his weapon up, Lucien had positioned himself behind her with something pressed to the side of her neck that caught the red emergency light and showed itself as a blade, compact, folding, the kind a man carried when he didn't want the weight of a firearm but needed something with presence. Put it down, Lucien said. His voice was the same. That was the thing Damien couldn't immediately process. The voice was exactly the same as it had been in 30 years of rooms, 30 years of counsel, 30 years of the kind of proximity that built itself into the architecture of a person's life. The same measured cadence, the same careful authority, entirely the same and entirely wrong. Lucien? Damien kept the gun level, kept his voice flat, found the operational stillness that his body knew how to find independent of what was happening in his chest. Think about the next 10 seconds. I've been thinking about the next 10 seconds for 25 years. Lucien's arm across Evelyn's collarbone was steady. She was not struggling. She was reading the situation with the cold clarity of someone who understood that struggle at this range with that blade was a specific kind of mistake. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was visible in the emergency light, controlled. Set the gun on the desk. Tell me what I'm looking at first. You know what you're looking at? You read the paper. I want to hear it from you. A beat of silence. The emergency lights hummed. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. One of Damien's men, or one of Lucien's, and the distinction between those two categories had just become a problem. Your father was going to burn everything, Lucien said. 25 years ago. He'd spent 4 years building that document at Renhold. Every piece of leverage he had, every dirty connection, every favor owed and crime committed by every person of consequence in this region. He was going to hand it to a federal contact and walk out. Walk out clean, with immunity, with his money, with his family. His voice carried the tone of someone who has rehearsed a thing until it has become a kind of truth. And take everyone with him on the way out, including people who had nothing to do with his reasons, including my father. Your father was dirty. My father was 47 years old with 3 children. Something shifted in Lucien's voice, the first crack in the surface, hairline thin. Your father decided his exit was worth more than my family's survival. He made that decision unilaterally, without discussion, without... He stopped. I found out 2 weeks before he planned to move. My father came to me. I was 30 years old, and my father was going to prison, and I made a decision. You had him killed. The words landed in the room and stayed there. I had a problem resolved, Lucien said, with the precision of a man who has spent decades choosing his language carefully. And then I spent the next 25 years making sure this organization survived. Making sure you survived. Every threat that came at you, I managed. Every mistake you made, and you made them, Damien, in the early years, you were reckless in ways that should have destroyed everything. I covered. I built what your father was going to incinerate, and I handed it to you piece by piece. His voice had steadied again. You owe the last 25 years of your life to what I did. Damien looked at him across the length of the study. The red light made shadows of everything. You owe me nothing, he said. We're past that. Gun on the desk. What happens to her if I do? She walks out of this building. I have no interest in her. A pause. The document at Renhold is another matter. The coordinates in that locket don't leave this room. Evelyn's voice came out level, considering the blade at her neck. The coordinates are already out of the room. I gave them to someone before your lights went off. Lucien's arm tightened fractionally. You're lying! I wrote them on a piece of paper and put it in the medical room with Grigor while you were in the courtyard with Aldous Mortani. She held his gaze forward, speaking to the wall opposite, not to the man behind her. I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I knew they mattered, and I knew this building wasn't safe, so I made a copy. It's what an archivist does. Silence. Damien watched Lucien's face in the emergency light. The calculation was visible. Not panic. Lucien didn't panic, but a rapid restructuring of the situation's parameters, the way a chess player looks when a piece they hadn't accounted for appears on the board. Grigor doesn't have a way to act on raw coordinates, Lucien said. He has a phone. She paused. I asked him to send it to an address I gave him. A contact I trust outside this organization. If he doesn't hear from me every 2 hours, it goes further. It was a bluff, or it wasn't, and Damien had no way to know which, but the quality of her voice was the quality of someone telling the truth, and either she was an exceptionally competent liar, or she'd actually done it, and he found that he believed it was the latter. Lucien believed it too, apparently. The blade at her neck didn't lower, but the arm that was holding her shifted, barely, a degree, with the involuntary quality of a body registering a loss. Then we have a different conversation, Lucien said. No, Damien said. We don't. He put the gun on the desk. Not because Lucien had told him to, because he'd decided to, which was a different thing, and the distinction mattered to him even now. He set it down with the grip facing himself and his hand on the desk beside it, and he looked at Lucien and said, Let her go. She moves to the door. Then you and I finish this. Finish it how? However it goes. Flat, without inflection. Lucien looked at him. In 30 years, Damien had seen this man in dozens of rooms under dozens of pressures, and he'd never seen him uncertain. He was uncertain now. Not afraid. Lucien's architecture didn't have much room for fear, but uncertain in the specific way of a man who has planned an endgame and found that the person at the center of it has stopped behaving according to the plan. Lucian released her. Evelyn moved to the door without rushing. She didn't run. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that running communicated panic, and panic communicated weakness, and neither served her. At the door, she stopped and looked back. "Go," Damien said. She went. Lucien lowered the blade. He didn't close it. He stood in the red-lit study across from the man he'd protected and controlled, and, in his particular way, cared for through 3 decades, and he looked tired. Not defeated. Tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who has held a thing in place through sheer force of sustained effort and has just been required to set it down. "The men in this building," Damien said, "how many of them are yours?" 4. "Which 4? Does it matter now?" "Yes." Lucian named them. Damien recognized all 4. 2 of them he'd have bet on, 2 of them he wouldn't have. The 2 surprises were worse than the 2 he'd have guessed, because they were the 2 he would have trusted with more. "The generator," Damien said. "Mace, he's outside. Call him off. Tell him to restore power." "And then what?" "And then we go somewhere with lights, and you tell me the rest of it." Yeah. Full power came back at the 9-minute mark. The building reorganized itself around the return of light. Rooms reappeared. The security monitors cycled back on. The controlled environment that Damien's estate represented reasserted itself in the way that physical space does when it's no longer just darkness and sound. Damien's men and Lucian's 4 men separated into a careful arrangement in the main hall, weapons holstered by mutual understanding of the mathematics involved, everyone aware that the situation was at a specific temperature and that a single wrong movement would change the chemistry of it permanently. Evelyn was in the security room with Varlo. She'd found Grigor on the way, and the look that passed between them when she arrived told Damien that her claim about the coordinates had been real. Grigor gave Damien a look over her shoulder that was equal parts apology and defiance, and Damien let it go. He took Lucien to the east room, a smaller space, a table, 2 chairs, no windows. He sat down. Lucien sat across from him without being asked, which was habit, 30 years of sitting across from each other. "The original document," Damien said. "My father's file. Is it still at Renhold?" "It was, as of 6 months ago." Lucien set the folded blade on the table between them. "I had someone check." "Why 6 months ago?" A pause. "Because she started looking." He didn't say Evelyn's name. "An inquiry came through an academic channel. Archival research requests, regional history of the hydroelectric projects. The institution forwarded it to the holding company that owns the Renhold facility. It came to me through 3 removes. He looked at his hands. "I've been tracking her for 6 months. You arranged for the blizzard encounter." The words were even. Damien kept them even deliberately, because the alternative was something he wasn't ready to perform in this room with this man. Not yet. Lucien didn't look away. "I knew her route. I knew her timing. The vehicle she was in went off the road at a point I'd selected because the terrain made recovery unlikely. My people left her at the chapel because it was a credible place to find a body in a storm." He paused. "I selected that location because your convoy would pass it." Damien looked at him. "I wasn't expecting you to stop," Lucien said. "In 30 years of knowing you, you have never stopped. That's not a criticism, it's the truth. You've driven past worse." Something moved in his face. "I miscalculated. You put her there to die. I put her there to disappear. There's a technical difference." "Lucien." "Yes." He held Damien's gaze. "I arranged for her to die in a location where her death would be logged as exposure, no investigation, clean, and you stopped, and she survived, and everything that was contained became uncontained." He turned the folded blade a quarter turn on the table. "I've been trying to recontain it since the convoy arrived here." "Tallow." "My man. I'm sorry for that specifically. Tallow was yours and he was a good man, and it wasn't supposed to happen the way it happened." A pause that had something genuine in it. Not guilt. Lucien wasn't built for guilt, but a specific acknowledgement of cost. "The plan was to recover the locket before she woke up." Tallow was in the way. The call to the checkpoint. Yes. The cameras looping. Yes. Damien sat with all of it. He let it be what it was, the full inventory of it, without rushing toward what came next, because men who rushed toward what came next in moments like this made errors that the moment didn't forgive. The photograph Aldous Mortani brought, he said. The meeting. 3 days before my father died. The Mortani old man was smarter than I gave him credit for. He documented more than I knew. Lucien's jaw tightened briefly. The man in the photograph with me was the intermediary. He arranged the technical side. He's been dead for 12 years. Who ordered it? Beyond your father's situation, who else was at that table? Lucien looked at him for a long moment. If I answer that, he said, you understand what it does. Answer it. The Renhold document covers 11 politicians and 4 federal prosecutors. 3 of those prosecutors are still active. 2 of the politicians hold positions that would make the exposure catastrophic at a national level. He turned the blade again. My arrangement with them was that the document stayed buried. In exchange, they managed the legal environment around this organization for 25 years. Every investigation that came close and veered off. Every witness problem that resolved itself. Every case that collapsed. He met Damien's eyes. Your freedom of operation for the last quarter century was purchased with your father's life and his buried evidence. That's the full truth of it. The room was very quiet. Damien thought about the 10,000 operational decisions he'd made in 25 years. The feeling that the organization had a kind of luck that other organizations didn't. The cases that fell apart at the right moments. The witnesses who changed their minds. He'd attributed it to Lucien's management. He hadn't been wrong about that, just wrong about the mechanism. And Franklin Mercer, he said. Evelyn's father. Mercer was independent. He was building his case from the outside without knowing the original document existed. He got close enough to be dangerous. Lucien's voice was level. I didn't arrange that. The politicians did. That one wasn't mine. But you knew. A pause. Yes. Damien stood. He walked to the corner of the room and stood there with his back to Lucien for a moment, which he did not do in rooms with dangerous people as a rule, but Lucien wasn't going to move on him, and they both knew it. Lucien had made his play, and it hadn't held, and they were past that now in the territory that came after. He turned back. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to write down every name, every politician, every prosecutor, every arrangement, everything you know about the Renhold document and what's in it. You're going to do that in the next 2 hours. He paused. And then we're going to go get the document. Lucien stared at him. You understand what that does to this organization. I understand exactly what it does. It ends it. Not damages. Ends. Everything we built. Everything you built on my father's grave. The flatness in his voice finally had something under it. Not volume, but weight. Write the names, Lucien. While Lucien wrote, the estate reorganized. Damien's 4 men were separated from Lucien's 4 by a set of quiet arrangements that involved enough visible firearms to make the logic clear without requiring anyone to explain it. Varlo managed it with the economy of movement that was his particular skill. No speeches, no confrontations, just the physical reorganization of space until the situation was as controlled as it was going to get. Evelyn came to find Damien in the main corridor at the 2-hour mark, while Lucien was still in the East Room. He planned the whole thing from the beginning, she said. Not a question. Yes. He put me on that road. Yes. She took that in. He watched her do it. The full weight of it arriving in sequence, the blizzard, the chapel, waking up in a strange estate, the locket, the not knowing, all of it arranged. She stood with it in a way that was not collapse and not performance of toughness, just the particular stillness of a person absorbing a true thing. My father, she said. Not Lucien, the politicians he was working with. Arranged by people Lucien was protecting. Yes. She nodded once, small and tight. And the locket. My mother gave it to me when I was young. How? I don't know that part yet. He looked at her. Someone connected to my father wanted you to have it, wanted those coordinates to survive. I don't know who yet. She reached up and touched the locket at her throat. Someone who knew what was at Renhold, and knew you'd eventually go looking, or hoped you would. He paused. Your mother may have known more than she told you. Evelyn's face changed slightly at that. Not pain exactly, more the expression of someone revising a picture they'd held for a long time. She was frightened my whole childhood, she said slowly. I thought it was grief, losing my father. She looked at the locket. She was keeping something. Yes. And she gave it to me instead of burying it. He had no answer for what that meant about her mother. What kind of person made a decision like that? To put a dangerous thing on a child's neck and carry the secret of it alone. He suspected it was the kind of person who had run out of better options and had decided on hope over safety, which was a decision he understood even if he couldn't endorse it. The facility at Renhold, Evelyn said. You're going there. Tonight. She looked at him. I'm coming. No. Damien. She said his name the same way she'd said it in that first conversation. Not with familiarity, with precision, like she'd decided the name was a tool and was using it deliberately. Those coordinates were in my locket. That document is the reason my father is dead. I have been tracked and manipulated and left to die in a blizzard by a man who's been running your organization from the inside for 25 years. Her voice was controlled and factual, and had something underneath it that wasn't anger so much as the long-burned certainty of someone who has been wronged at a foundational level and has waited a long time to be in a position to do something about it. I'm coming. He looked at her for a moment. You follow my direction on the ground, he said, without argument. Within reason. Not within reason. Without argument. She held his gaze. Agreed. They left at 9 that night with 5 vehicles and 11 men, moving in a convoy that took the north road rather than the pass, adding 40 minutes to the route to avoid any approach that had been used before. Lucien's 4 men stayed at the estate under Varlo's supervision, contained, not comfortable, aware of the mathematics. Lucien himself was in the second vehicle. Damien had made that decision, and it had not been a simple one. Lucien knew the Renhold facility. He knew what had been stored there and where and how the building's internal systems worked. That knowledge had operational value that outweighed the risk, or so Damien had calculated. What it felt like to sit in a vehicle with a man who had arranged your father's death and built you a career on the grave of it. That was a different calculation, one that didn't have a unit of measurement. Lucien rode in silence. He'd finished the list of names an hour earlier and given it to Damien without comment. Damien had read it once and put it in his inside pocket and not looked at it again. Evelyn rode in the lead vehicle, in the back seat beside Damien, which she'd chosen without asking. She sat with the locket in her palm and her eyes on the dark road, and for the first 20 minutes of the drive, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "When this is over, what happens to you?" He looked at the road. "Depends on how it goes. If the document is what Lucien says, if it implicates who he says it does, if it becomes public, it ends things here, yes. The organization, and a lot of what surrounds it." She turned the locket. "Is that what you want?" He thought about the question honestly, which he hadn't done before this moment. Not because he'd been avoiding it, but because the shape of the answer had been changing since a blizzard 2 nights ago. "My father wanted out," he said. "He built an exit. Someone took it from him." He looked at the road. "I've spent 25 years building the same thing he built. Same structure, same problems, same cost." He paused. Maybe the exit was always supposed to be the point. She was quiet for a moment. "He left the evidence for a reason," she said. "He didn't destroy it, he stored it. Waiting for the right moment, or the right person." The convoy moved through the dark mountain road, headlights cutting the black and narrow columns, the forest pressing close on both sides, and the snow in the tree branches catching the light and throwing it back in small, cold fragments. At the 40-minute mark, Damien's phone went. Varlo. He answered. "We've got a problem," Varlo said, and it was the same tone as every time before, the tone that meant the problem was already in motion. 4 vehicles just came up the south road. They bypassed the main checkpoint, went around it through the service road, armed, moving fast, heading toward the estate. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. How many men? Counting vehicles, minimum 16. Could be more. Who are they? Best guess from the vehicle types and the approach pattern? A pause. Not Mortani. Not anyone local. Another pause, shorter. These are professionals, Damien. This is a hired crew. He looked at Lucien's vehicle in the rear-view mirror. Get our people out of the estate, he said. Abandon the position. Meet us at Renhold. He paused. And Varlo, bring Lucien's four with you. They're not an asset anymore. They're a liability if they're in the building when that crew arrives. Understood. What about the estate itself? He thought about the estate. 11 years of infrastructure. 3 floors, 12 rooms that mattered. The basement that served purposes. Let it go, he said. He ended the call. Lucien had lowered his window in the second vehicle. He was looking back at Damien's vehicle, and even in the dark and the distance, the quality of his attention was legible. He knew. He'd probably known this call was coming. The politicians whose names were on his list had been watching this situation the way they'd been watching everything for 25 years, and they'd decided that the level of exposure justified a different kind of resolution. They weren't coming for the document. The document had been buried for 25 years, and they could live with its existence as long as it stayed buried. They were coming for the people who knew about it. Damien tapped the glass partition. His driver looked back. Renhold, Damien said. Faster. The convoy accelerated into the dark. Evelyn's hand found the door grip, braced against the increased speed without comment. She looked at him. The people Lucien named, she said. They're coming. For us. For everyone. He looked at the road ahead. We need that document before they get to it first, and we need it in the right hands before they can stop us. And we have, he checked his phone for the time, approximately 40 minutes before the gap closes. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then drive faster, she said. The vehicles ahead were already moving. The mountain road was dark, and the snow was deep on the shoulders, and the trees went past in long, dark lines. And somewhere behind them, a convoy of hired professionals was working through the math of how to make 4 people and a 25-year-old secret disappear cleanly in the kind of weather that made disappearing easy. And Damien watched the road and thought about his father at a desk with his back turned, unaware of the boy in the doorway. And he pushed every other thought aside and focused on the next 40 minutes, because the next 40 minutes were the only thing that was going to matter for the rest of whatever came after. The first explosion lit up the sky behind them at the 38-minute mark, orange and white against the black reflected in the snow, the sound arriving 3 seconds after the light, the way sound always did at distance. The estate. Gone. In the front seat, his driver didn't flinch, didn't slow. Good man. Evelyn watched the light fade in the rear window. Her face in the orange reflection was very still. Now, she said quietly. Now, he said. And the convoy drove toward Renhold through the dark and the cold and the burning light behind them, with everything they needed to end this ahead, and everything they'd lost already going to smoke in the mountain air. The Renhold facility emerged from the dark like something the mountain had been keeping secret. It sat at the end of a service road that hadn't seen regular traffic in 15 years. A compound of low concrete buildings arranged around the base of a dam that had been ambitious once and was now just massive. A curved wall of gray aggregate rising 40 meters above the valley floor. The reservoir behind it a black mirror under the night sky. The spillway channels on either side crusted with ice that the recent storm had built up in thick, irregular formations. The hydroelectric equipment was still partly functional, maintained by the holding company that owned the property on paper, which meant the lights in the main turbine building still worked and the access system still ran on grid power, which was the detail Damien had been counting on. They cut the convoy's headlights 300 meters out and came in slow and dark on a road that was barely a road, the vehicles rocking over frozen ruts. 11 men plus Damien, plus Evelyn, plus Lucien, which was the number they had, and not the number they'd have chosen. Varlo had reached them on the mountain road 20 minutes back, coming up from the estate through a side approach with Lucien's 4 men in tow. and the brief summary he delivered through the window of Damien's vehicle had been precise and ugly. The hired crew had come in hard and fast, 8 men visible with likely more on perimeter, professional equipment and professional movement patterns. The estate was gone. 2 of Damien's men who'd been slow to evacuate were unaccounted for. The crew had not followed the convoy north, which meant either they didn't know where the convoy was going or they had another way to get there. Damien assumed the latter. He was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, moving toward the facility's main access door with Varlo beside him and the rest of the men deploying behind in the arrangement they'd worked out in the last 10 minutes of the drive. Evelyn came with them, which he'd stopped arguing about because arguing about it cost time and she'd made her position clear. Lucien was the last one out of his vehicle. He came up beside Damien at the access door without being asked. "Control room is the 3rd building," he said. "The storage was in the sub-basement of the main turbine hall. Your father used the secondary maintenance shaft. There's a false panel on the east wall of the lower level." He said it the way a man gives directions to a place he's been many times. Matter of fact. Whatever he was feeling about standing in front of the building where he'd buried his greatest crime, he'd put it somewhere it wasn't going to show. "The access code for the sub-basement is 6 digits. I'll need to be there to enter it." "Why would I believe you know it after 25 years? "Because I've been checking the document was still there every 3 years for 25 years. A pause. 6-digit code. Changes on a cycle I've maintained. Damien looked at him. There was nothing to say to that, so he didn't say anything, and they went in. The main access door took Lucien 40 seconds with the panel, and then they were inside the facility's outer corridor, concrete and cold, the kind of cold that had been building for decades in a structure that wasn't actively heated. A deep settled cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside, and everything to do with mass and time. The corridor lighting was emergency fluorescent, activated by motion, flickering on in sections as they moved through it. Their breath came in clouds, boots on concrete, the sound bouncing in the narrow space. The turbine hall opened up in front of them like a cathedral built by people who didn't believe in anything except engineering. A vast interior space with the turbine housings along the floor, enormous and silent, the overhead gantry cranes parked at their rest positions, the walls running with condensation that had frozen in places into long, clear columns. The air smelled of mineral water and old metal and something else underneath that was harder to name, the particular smell of machinery that had been waiting. "East wall," Lucien said, and pointed. They moved. They were 60 feet from the east wall when the facility's exterior lights came on. All of them, simultaneously. The perimeter floods that the maintenance systems ran on automatic, triggered by the motion sensors at the compound boundary. Through the high windows of the turbine hall, the compound outside went from black to white-yellow, and in the sudden contrast, Damien saw the shapes moving on the access road. 3 vehicles, moving fast. "They had the location," Varlo said. "Yes." Damien turned to the men behind him. "Positions, now." To Lucien, "You and I go down. Varlo holds this floor." To Evelyn, "Stay with Varlo." "No." Evelyn, "If you don't come back, I need to be where the document is." Her voice was the voice of someone who'd thought this through and arrived at a conclusion they weren't going to be argued out of. "I go down with you." He didn't have time. "Fine. Move." The sub-basement access was a stairwell behind a service door in the east wall, and the door took Lucien another 30 seconds, and above them, as they went down, the first shots came through. Not close. The initial exchange was at the compound perimeter, Damien's men buying time against the crew coming in from the road, and the sound of it in the concrete structure was everywhere at once, directionless, arriving from the walls and the floor as much as the air. The sub-basement was low-ceilinged and ran the length of the turbine hall above, a maintenance space full of pipe housing and electrical conduit and the secondary systems that the main floor didn't have room for. The air was colder here. Their breath was thick. Lucien went to the panel at the east wall without hesitation, a section of concrete that looked like all the other sections of concrete until you were close enough to see the seam at the edges. He pressed a recessed catch at knee height, and the panel swung inward on a pivot, smooth and balanced, engineered to move quietly. Behind it, a space roughly the size of a large closet, metal shelving along 3 walls. On the center shelf, a document safe, Heavy-gauge steel bolted to the shelf frame with a combination lock that had not been built for convenience. Lucien went to it. His hands were very steady, Damien noticed. He worked the combination with the focused attention of someone performing a task he'd done in his mind many more times than he'd done it physically. Above them, the gunfire was louder now, closer. A burst of automatic fire, then a gap, then 3 single shots in sequence. The safe opened. Inside, a document case, the kind built for transport, with hard sides and a waterproof seal and a strap handle. It was not what Damien had expected. He'd pictured something older, something that showed its age. This looked functional and maintained. I replace the original storage every 5 years, Lucien said, reading the look. Paper degrades. The content is the same. He looked at the case. Your father typed it himself, 312 pages. He was thorough. A pause. He was always thorough. Damien picked up the case. He held it for a moment with both hands on the handle, and it was just a case, just the physical weight of it, which was less than he'd expected, maybe 4 kilograms. And there was nothing to feel in holding it except the ordinary reality of an object, and yet, 25 years. His father at a desk that he'd stood in the doorway of as a boy, not knowing he was watching a man trying to build an exit. Everything that had happened since, the whole machinery of it, tracing back to what was in this case. Let's go, Evelyn said. About Sim. They came up from the sub-basement into a turbine hall that had changed. 2 of Damien's men were on the floor. Not dead, both moving, one with a hand pressed to his thigh, one getting back to his feet with a weapon in his hand and blood on his chin. The crew had breached the main entrance, and the turbine hall's interior was now a space of moving shapes and covering positions, the fluorescent overheads taking sporadic hits that made the lighting strobe and cut, the sound of the exchange enormous in the hard-walled space. Varlo appeared from behind the nearest turbine housing, moving low. He looked at the case in Damien's hand and at the situation around them, and his face ran through its quick private calculation. 7 of theirs inside, he said rapidly. 3 still on the perimeter. Our people have the east exit covered, but not for long. They've got numbers, and they're pushing. Who's leading them? Don't know. No communication, no IDs? They're not talking. Varlo moved his eyes to Lucien. One of them specifically is trying to reach him. A look of professional assessment at Lucien. Not you. Him. Lucien's face changed. It was small. A tightening at the jaw, a very slight stillness around the eyes. But Damien was watching for it, and he caught it. Who else knows you're here? Damien said. Nobody who... Lucien stopped. Who? A beat. My son. The word landed in the room. Damien looked at him. You have a son, he said. This was not information he had. In 30 years of knowing Lucy and Caro, in 30 years of meetings and decisions and shared meals and thousands of hours of conversation, in 30 years of proximity that should have covered everything that mattered about a person, Damien had never known this. He's 23, Lucien said. His voice had changed. The control in it was still there, but it was load-bearing now in a way it hadn't been before. He doesn't use my name. He's been outside all of this. I kept him outside. A pause. Evidently not outside enough. The politician sent someone to him to use as leverage. Yes. He looked at the case. Or to send here. Damien turned to Varlo. The man trying to reach Lucien? Where? North side of the hall, behind the number 3 turbine housing. Take me. They moved along the east wall. Low and fast, the gunfire continuing in irregular bursts from the main entrance side where Damien's remaining men were holding the breach. A round sparked off the turbine housing 6 inches from Damien's shoulder as they went, and he felt the metal fragment graze his forearm through the jacket sleeve. Not deep, a surface cut, the warm immediate spread of it in the cold air. And he kept moving. He came around the north end of the number 3 turbine housing and stopped. The man crouching on the other side was young. 23 was exactly right. He had Lucien's jaw and Lucien's eyes and none of Lucien's composure, which made sense because he was 23 years old, and he was in a firefight in an abandoned dam, and he was terrified. He had a weapon in his hand that he was holding with the grip of someone who'd been trained with it but wasn't comfortable with it. When he saw Damien, he raised it, and then he saw Varlo flanking from the left, and he made the calculation and he lowered it. His name, Damien would learn later, was Remy. "Where's your father?" Remy said. Not a demand. Raw, frightened, looking past Damien. Lucien came around the housing. The look between them was not something Damien needed to annotate. 30 years of understanding what people's faces meant when they thought nothing was at stake. And this was the face of a man looking at his son in a situation he'd constructed specifically to keep his son away from. He'd built a wall for 25 years, and the wall had a door in it that he hadn't known about. "They took me 2 days ago," Remy said. "To Lucien only. They said I had to find you or—" He stopped. "I didn't have a choice." "I know," Lucien said. "They're not going to let any of us leave." "I know that too." Damien held the document case. He looked at Remy. He looked at Lucien. He looked at the case. "Call them off," he said to Remy. "You have a way to contact whoever's running this crew. Use it. Tell them to pull back." "They won't." "Tell them the document is destroyed. Tell them we found the storage and it was already gone. Flood damage, water damage, gone." He held the young man's eyes. "Give them a reason to stop. Whatever you need to say." Remy looked at his father. Lucien nodded. One motion, small and definitive. Remy got on his phone. The crew didn't pull back entirely. Professionals didn't break off on a phone call from an asset. They waited for confirmation. But the pressure eased. The push from the main entrance stopped advancing. The men at the perimeter held position. It bought time, which was all Damien had asked for. He used the time to move the document case to the east exit and put it in Evelyn's hands. "You know what to do with this," he said. She looked at him. "You're not coming." "I'm coming, but if I don't, stop." "Evelyn, tell me you're coming." She said it without softness, the way you said things that you needed to be true. "Tell me that, and mean it." He looked at her face in the strobing light of the turbine hall, and he thought about a woman in the snow outside a chapel that he'd almost driven past, and he thought about a little boy in a doorway, and he said, "I'm coming." She went to the east exit with 2 of Damien's men and the case. He turned back. "That." The crew's commander was a man named Doyle. Damien learned this later, but he saw him first through a gap in the turbine housings, directing his people from the main entrance with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd run operations in harder spaces than this. He was methodical. He wasn't in a hurry. He was waiting for the confirmation that Remy's call hadn't actually produced, and he was beginning to understand that the confirmation wasn't coming. Damien had 7 men still functional inside the hall, counting Varlo. The crew had reduced to 5 inside after 2 of them had gone down in the initial exchange. The math was close enough to be interesting. He found Varlo behind the second turbine housing. He said, "I need to get to the control room." Varlo looked at him. "Why?" "The dam's floodgates run from the control room. Emergency release protocol." He paused. "If I trigger it, the lower maintenance level floods. Everything in the sub-basement goes." Varlo was quiet for a moment. "Including anyone in it. Their people have been pushing toward the sub-basement since they came in. They know what's down there." He looked at the control room door on the north wall of the hall, 60 feet across open floor. "If the sub-basement floods, the document is confirmed gone as far as they're concerned. The threat is neutralized. They have no reason to finish this. We'd have 5 minutes before the lower level fills, maybe less. More than enough to get our people out of the building." Varlo looked at the 60 feet of open floor between them and the control room door. "That's not a subtle move." "No." A pause. "I'll take the east side, draw their attention." He met Damien's eyes. "You go straight across, fast as you've ever gone." "Varlo, I know." He checked his weapon. "Go when I move." He moved. Varlo went east along the wall at a pace that was exactly fast enough to draw fire. Controlled exposure, the kind of movement that said, "I'm here without saying shoot me," which was a distinction that required very precise calibration, and Varlo had it. 2 of the crew's men shifted position toward him. A third followed. Damien went. 60 feet of open concrete floor, the overhead fluorescence still strobing from earlier hits. His footsteps loud in his own ears and inaudible beneath the gunfire that Varlo was generating on the east side. He hit the control room door at a run, shoulder first, and it gave, not locked, maintenance access, the heavy lever handle going down under his weight. Inside, a room that smelled of electronics and old coffee and the specific staleness of a space where people worked nights. Banks of monitors, most dark. The main control console running down the center. The emergency systems panel on the south wall, bright red housing, a security cover over the primary controls. He crossed to it. The cover required a key or a bypass. He didn't have the key. He took out his weapon and used the grip to break the housing at the lower edge, which was faster than the key would have been and less precise. The panel came open. The emergency floodgate release was labeled clearly because in emergencies, labels were what stood between order and catastrophe. He flipped the cover off the primary switch. The intercom beside the console was live, the facility's internal system. He keyed it. His voice went through the building. "This is Damien Vescari." He spoke clearly, without hurry, the way he'd learned to speak when he needed to be heard by people who were in various states of not wanting to hear him. "Your asset told you the document was destroyed. He was telling you the truth. I'm confirming it now. In 45 seconds, I'm releasing the dam's lower maintenance floodgates. Anyone in the sub-basement has 45 seconds to be elsewhere. Anyone in this building who wants to walk away from tonight has 45 seconds to be outside." A pause. "I'd use them." He released the intercom. He put his hand on the switch. He thought about his father. 312 pages typed himself. Thorough. Always thorough. Building an exit he never got to use. He looked at the switch. From somewhere in the building, a sound. Not gunfire, something else. A kind of movement, a shift in the acoustic quality of the turbine hall. The specific change in ambient sound that happens when people who are staying become people who are leaving. He waited the full 45 seconds. He threw the switch. The sound the floodgates made when they opened was not dramatic. A deep mechanical engagement beneath the floor, the muffled report of water finding new space. The building registering it through its foundations in a low vibration that came up through the soles of his feet. The sub-basement, he knew, would be filling now. The maintenance channels that ran under the turbine floor would be taking water within 2 minutes, and the lower maintenance level would be a meter deep within 5. And the secondary storage space behind the false panel in the east wall would be sealed off by the rising water within 8. A room he'd never seen before tonight was erasing itself. He left the control room at a run. The turbine hall was not empty. Doyle was standing in the center of it, and he was not leaving. His 4 remaining men were positioned around him in a loose covering arrangement, and they were all looking at Damien, and the mathematics of the room had changed again in a way that was not in Damien's favor. But Doyle's attention was not on Damien. It was on Lucien, who was standing 20 feet to Damien's left with Remy beside him, and Doyle was looking at Lucien with the specific attention of a man who has a set of instructions and is deciding whether the instructions still apply. "The document," Doyle said. "Flooding," Damien said. "Gone. I'll need confirmation. Check the sub-basement in 10 minutes. Bring diving equipment." Doyle looked at him. His face was the face of a professional doing a professional's job, which meant it wasn't personal and it wasn't emotional, and it was entirely focused on the outcome he'd been paid to produce. "My instructions covered the document and the people who know what's in it. Your instructions came from people whose names are on a list that's already outside this building," Damien said. "In hands that aren't mine. That list goes public whether I walk out of here or not." He held Doyle's gaze. "Think about what you're being paid to clean up, and whether the people paying you are going to be in a position to pay anything once that list lands." The building shook, not dramatically. A deep structural tremor, the kind that concrete makes when water loads shift at significant volume. The floodgates had fully engaged. Somewhere beneath the floor, the hydrology of the facility was reorganizing itself. Doyle looked at the floor, looked at his men, looked at Damien. "We're leaving," he said. He and his 4 men walked to the main entrance and out into the compound, and that was the last Damien saw of them. Outside, the convoy was still intact. Varlo was bleeding from a cut at his hairline, wearing it like something he'd deal with eventually. 3 of Damien's men had injuries that were not critical. One was sitting against the exterior wall with a tourniquet on his left arm, applied by someone who'd done it fast and correctly, and he was conscious and profane about his condition, which Damien took as a good sign. Evelyn was at the second vehicle. She had the document case against her chest, both arms around it. When she saw Damien come out of the main entrance, she did not run toward him, which he appreciated because he was not running himself. He was moving with the deliberate gait of someone who has just used up a significant amount of something that doesn't refill quickly. When he reached her, she looked at his arm, the jacket sleeve dark with blood from the metal fragment, and her jaw tightened briefly. "It's surface," he said. "I know, I can see that." She looked at him. "You flooded it?" "Yes." "The sub-basement?" "Yes." She looked at the facility. The building gave no outward indication of what was happening in its lower levels, but the ground carried it, a very faint vibration, rhythmic with the water movement, the kind you felt through the soles of your feet if you were standing still and paying attention. "He built it there for a reason," she said. "About her father. Or his." The pronoun covered both, and she'd left it that way deliberately. "He built it to use it," Damien said. We're going to use it." She looked at him. "Doyle's crew. They'll report back. To people whose names are on a list. A list that's in my hands. And a contact outside this situation who has the coordinates." He looked at the case. "And now the content." She was quiet for a moment. "Your father's 312 pages, she said. "Yes." "He was thorough. Apparently it runs in the family." He looked at the case in her arms. "We need to move. Doyle isn't coming back tonight, but tonight has a time limit." Behind them, Lucien came out of the main entrance with Remy beside him, and the sight of the 2 of them together in the compound lights, the older man and the younger one with the same jaw and the same particular set to the shoulders, was a thing Damien looked at once and then looked away from, because some things you needed to let exist at the edge of your attention before you could figure out what to do with them. The convoy began to organize. Varlo came up beside Damien and said quietly, "Where are we going?" Damien looked at the mountain. The sky above it was beginning to change. Not light yet, not for another 2 hours, but the deep, pure black of the middle night had started to thin at the edges, the first imperceptible announcement of something approaching. "Somewhere with a phone signal and a federal contact," he said. "I need to make a call before morning." In the second vehicle, he sat with Evelyn and the document case between them and the mountain going past in the dark outside, and he thought about the switch in the control room and what it had felt like to throw it, and what it meant that it had not felt like loss. It had felt like something else, something his father might have recognized if he'd had the chance to feel it. The convoy moved down from the mountain toward the valley lights below, and behind them the Renhold facility stood in the dark, with water rising in its lower levels, and 25 years of buried truth completing its long-delayed journey toward the surface. And somewhere in the sky above the eastern peaks, the first suggestion of dawn was beginning to make its quiet case against the night. And Damien Viscari rode toward it with a document case and a woman who'd been left to die in the snow and the full weight of everything that was about to break open, holding all of it in his hands for the first time in his life, with no one behind him pulling the strings. The valley lights grew closer through the windshield, and he let himself look at them. Small and scattered and ordinary. The kind of lights that meant people sleeping in houses with no idea what moved through the dark above them. And he thought that this was perhaps the last night those lights would mean exactly what they'd always meant, because by morning the names on Lucien's list would be in federal hands, and the world those names had built would begin its slow public collapse. Evelyn's shoulder was against his. She hadn't moved away from it, and neither had he. "When it's over," she said. Not a question this time. "When it's over," he said. She didn't ask him to finish the sentence. She already knew what came after it, or she was willing to wait until it was true before she needed the words for it. And either way, the silence that followed was not empty. It held something neither of them had expected to be carrying when the night began. The convoy reached the valley floor as the first gray light touched the peaks above Renhold, and Damien Viscari made the call that would end the only life he'd ever known, and his voice was steady when he made it. The federal contact's name was Harlan Briggs, and he answered on the second ring at 4:40 in the morning, which told Damien that Briggs had been awake and waiting, which told Damien that Evelyn's outside contact had already moved, that the coordinates and the preliminary information had already reached someone capable of acting on them, that the machinery had begun turning before Damien made his call. He sat with that for a moment. The convoy had stopped at a fuel station on the Valley Road, the kind of place that ran 24 hours because the mountain freight routes needed it. Fluorescent light and diesel smell, and a teenager behind the counter who looked at 11 armed men with varying degrees of injury and decided that whatever was happening was not his problem. Damien stood outside the passenger door in the cold, with his phone to his ear and the document case on the seat behind him and Evelyn 3 feet away, not pretending she wasn't listening. Briggs said, "I've been briefed on the preliminary. Is the document intact?" "Yes." "Where?" "With me. For the next 2 hours, with me. After that, wherever you tell me." A pause on the line. The pause of a man calculating, measuring the weight and credibility of what he was holding. Briggs had been a federal investigator for 22 years and had spent the last 8 of them specifically on organized crime and political corruption in the region, which meant he was either the right person for this or he was on the list, and Damien had made that calculation already. "There are 11 names on the preliminary list I received," Briggs said. "There are more in the document." Another pause. "How many more?" "My father was thorough." Damien looked at the mountains. "You'll have the full count when I have a guarantee in writing for everyone in my convoy. Immunity for testimony, clean passage, by name." "That takes time, I may not." "Then start now." He kept his voice even. "You have 2 hours." He ended the call. Varlo appeared beside him with a cup of gas station coffee that was bad enough to be useful, handed it over without comment. Damien drank half of it standing in the cold and watched the eastern sky doing what it had been threatening to do for the last hour, moving through the gray stages toward something that was going to be light, eventually, whether or not anyone was ready for it. "Briggs," Varlo said. Not a question. "Yes." "You trust him." "I trust that he wants what's in that case more than he wants anything else right now." He finished the coffee. "That's enough." Varlo looked at the mountains, the estate. Gone. Everything in it. Everything in it. He looked at Varlo's cut hairline, the dried blood there. "You built 11 years of that with me." "I did." "I'm sorry for it." Varlo was quiet for a moment, then, "I built it with you. I didn't build it for it." He picked up the empty cup. "What comes next is still something to build." He went back inside. Damien stood in the cold until the coffee was gone and the sky was perceptibly lighter, and then he got back in the vehicle. Lucian asked to speak to him at 5:15, which Damien had been expecting. They stood outside the fuel station's east wall, out of earshot of the convoy, in a narrow channel between the building and a chain-link fence that the years had bent into irregular waves. The light was coming now, slow and gray and without warmth, the kind of dawn that didn't celebrate itself. Lucien looked like a man who had slept badly for 25 years and was only now beginning to understand why. The composure was still there. It was structural in him, not something he put on, but it was doing different work than usual. It was holding something in rather than projecting something out. "Remy goes on the immunity list," Damien said, before Lucien could speak. Lucien's jaw moved. He had no prior involvement. "I know, he goes on the list anyway, clean and documented." He looked at him. "That's not negotiable and it's not a favor. It's what's happening." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." Damien didn't respond to that. "I need to say something," Lucien said. "Say it." "What I did 25 years ago." He stopped, started again. "I've told myself many versions of it over the years. Every version had a logic. Your father's betrayal of my family, the pragmatic necessity, the organization's survival." He looked at the bent fence. "None of them were wrong exactly. They also weren't the reason." He paused. "The reason was simpler. I was 30 years old, and I was frightened, and I made a decision that I then spent the next 25 years building a story around." He turned back. "I want you to know I know the difference." Damien looked at him for a long time. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 30 years, he said. Yes, I know. He looked at the sky. It doesn't fix anything. I know that too. You'll testify to everything. The meeting, the arrangement, the politicians, the arrangement around Mercer. He held Lucien's gaze. All of it. Yes. And then whatever Briggs decides to do with it. Yes. Lucien's voice was level. He'd arrived at this place ahead of tonight. Damien understood that now, saw the shape of it. The list he'd written in 2 hours, the names given without evasion or omission, the cooperation in the sub-basement. Lucien had made his decision before the convoy left the estate. Maybe before that. Maybe in the East Room, when Damien had said, "Write the names," and Lucien had picked up the pen without argument. "I've been ready to stop for a long time," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to do it without losing Remy in the fallout." "Remy's on the list." "Yes." He exhaled. A small sound. Almost nothing. "Yes." They stood in the gray light for another moment, and then Damien walked back to the convoy, and Lucien followed, and that was the last private conversation they would have for a very long time. Briggs called back at 6:40 with the immunity agreements in preliminary form, transmitted electronically. 12 names, including Remy Caro, listed under a surname that wasn't Caro, which was a detail Damien noted and didn't mention. The handoff happened at 8:15 in the parking structure of a government building in the Valley City, a location Briggs had chosen because it had no cameras in the lower level, a deliberate blind spot that Briggs had apparently maintained for years for situations exactly like this one. Damien walked in with the document case and Varlo at his shoulder and Evelyn on his left, and Briggs was waiting with 2 men whose presence suggested federal authority without displaying it. Briggs was 60, gray, built like a man who'd stopped having illusions about his body sometime in his 40s and had made a workable arrangement with what remained. He looked at the document case the way people look at things they've been trying to reach for a long time and have mostly stopped believing they'd actually hold. He looked at Damien. "Viscari. Briggs. You understand what you're handing me." "I understand exactly what I'm handing you." He held the case at his side, not extended yet. 11 politicians, 4 federal prosecutors, 3 of them still active. He let that sit for a moment, including the prosecutor currently overseeing the organized crime task force for this region. Briggs's face didn't move. "Name." "Kellerman." He watched it land, watched Briggs absorb it with the stillness of a man who'd suspected something and hadn't wanted to be right. "He's in the document, complete. Dated transactions, specific instructions, correspondence that my father kept copies of." He paused. "Kellerman is the reason Franklin Mercer's witnesses recanted. Kellerman managed it directly. That's documented too." Evelyn, beside him, was very still. Briggs looked at her. "You're Mercer's daughter." "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment with the particular look of a man reviewing something privately. A record of failures, maybe. Cases that hadn't held. Witnesses who'd changed their minds. A colleague whose death had been ruled cardiac and that he'd never fully believed. He said nothing. He turned back to Damien. "My office has been subject to Kellerman's oversight for 4 years." "I know. Which means I don't know what's compromised and what isn't. Which is why you're taking this personally and not through your office." Damien extended the case. "And why you answered on the second ring at 4:40 in the morning." Briggs took the case. His hands were steady. What came after was not fast. The law moved at its own pace, which was nothing like the pace of the night that had preceded it, and the distance between those 2 speeds was something Damien had to learn to inhabit. He'd spent 30 years in a world where decisions produced immediate physical consequences, where the gap between choice and result was measured in hours or days at most, where cause and effect were close enough to touch. The process that Briggs set in motion with the contents of that case moved in weeks and months, through sealed proceedings and quiet arrests and the kind of institutional unraveling that happened in conference rooms and courtrooms rather than turbine halls and mountain roads. Kellerman was the first, arrested on a Tuesday morning at his home in a suburb that bore no relationship to the work he'd been doing inside it. 3 of the other prosecutors followed within the week. The politicians took longer. Their legal insulation was thicker, their connections to the process itself more embedded. But the document was thorough, and Marco Vescari had been thorough, and thorough was what finally made the difference. Damien knew most of this secondhand. He was not in a position to watch it happen directly, because the immunity agreement had requirements, and the requirements had a geography. And the geography for the first 4 months was a facility outside the city that was not a prison, and not entirely not a prison, where the testimony process operated at the pace that federal cooperation operated at, which was relentless and repetitive and deeply unglamorous. He gave testimony 41 times. He answered the same questions in different sequences and was asked to clarify and was asked to confirm and was asked to walk through timelines that he walked through until they were as familiar as his own name. Varlo gave testimony. 3 of his other men gave testimony. Lucien gave testimony for 9 days straight, which was the most consecutive days of testimony in the proceeding, and the transcript of it ran to 400 pages. Remy Caro, whose name was documented as clean, was not required to testify. He left the region before the proceedings concluded and sent his father a single letter that Lucien received in the facility where he was held pending trial, and that Lucien read, according to the guard who was present, 3 times before folding it. Damien was not told what the letter said. He didn't ask. Boss. Evelyn was not in this facility. The immunity agreement covered her as a witness, which meant she was free and required to remain available, which meant she stayed in the Valley City in a temporary arrangement that became less temporary as the weeks became months. She had no apartment to return to. Her life before the blizzard had been a mobile, provisional thing, the life of someone who'd been moving since childhood and hadn't fully stopped. And so she stayed in the city and worked, because working was what she did when things were unresolved, and things were profoundly unresolved. She appeared at the facility to give testimony twice. Both times Damien was in a different part of the building and didn't see her. He knew she'd been there from Briggs, who told him with the neutral efficiency of someone passing along logistical information and not commenting on what it meant. He wrote to her once, 3 sentences on paper, which was the available medium. The sentences were not eloquent. They said what they said, which was that he was aware the timeline was uncertain and that he intended to be on the other side of it, and that he hoped she was sleeping. She wrote back 6 days later. 4 sentences. She was sleeping adequately. She had testified without difficulty. She had begun the preliminary work on establishing a nonprofit foundation, subject to pending legal clearances, connected to mountain rescue services in the Black Ridge area. The 4th sentence said, I go past the chapel sometimes. The road's been cleared. He read the 4 sentences many times. Lucien's trial lasted 3 weeks and produced a verdict that was not in question from approximately the 2nd day. The sentence was significant and was not appealed. On the day it was handed down, Damien was in a conference room in the facility giving his 39th round of testimony, and he learned about it from a federal aide who passed a note to Briggs, who read it and set it face down on the table and continued the session. Afterward, when the room had cleared, Briggs handed Damien the note. He read it. He set it on the table. He thought about Lucien at 30 years old, frightened, making a decision he spent the rest of his life building a story around. He thought about what it meant to know someone for 30 years and not know them, and whether those 2 things were actually as incompatible as they appeared. He thought about 30 years of loyalty that was real and 30 years of crime that was also real, and the way those 2 things had coexisted in one person without either one canceling the other out. He thought about his father at the desk. He thought about the boy in the doorway. He folded the note and put it in his pocket and went back to his room, which had a window that faced east and a view of the mountains that he'd been looking at for 4 months and had not grown tired of. He was released from the facility's requirements on a morning in late spring when the snow was off the valley floor and only on the peaks, and the air had the quality that air gets in the mountains when winter is genuinely over rather than just pausing, a lightness to it, an absence of the weight that cold puts in everything. Varlo picked him up. They drove without talking for the first 20 minutes, which was comfortable in the way that silence is comfortable between people who've been in enough rooms together that the silence has its own texture. Where? Varlo said eventually. Damien thought about it. The chapel. Varlo looked at him sideways. "The one on the Renhold Road," Damien said. "I know which one." He drove. After a moment, "She'll be there?" "I don't know." He looked at the mountains going past. "I know she goes there." They drove the valley road north and then the mountain road east, and the road climbed through the kinds of turns that in winter had been blind and dangerous, and in spring were just steep, the forest on both sides running with snowmelt and new growth, the occasional rock slide debris from the winter still on the shoulder in places. The road had been cleared and maintained and showed no evidence of the night that had happened on it, which was either the efficiency of the relevant authorities or the ordinary indifference of infrastructure to the events that occurred beside it. The chapel appeared at the road's shoulder where it had always been, a low stone structure, small, old, the door standing open now rather than hanging from one hinge the way it had been in the blizzard. The snow that had covered it was gone. Someone had cleared the path to the door and had set 2 flat stones at the entrance as a rough step. The stone itself was the same, unchanged in the way of things built to outlast the weather that tested them. There was a car parked at the shoulder. Varlo pulled up behind it and stopped and looked at Damien. Damien got out. She was inside the chapel, standing at the far wall, her back to the door. She had a notebook in one hand and a measuring tape in the other, and was making a note of something with the focused inattention of a person doing a physical task while thinking about something else. She wore a coat that was correct for the weather, which he noticed and didn't say anything about. She heard him come in and turned. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in that first room, the measuring quality, the attention that wasn't passive. Then something shifted in her face that was not the measuring quality and was not passive. "You look tired," she said. 41 rounds of testimony. "I know, I counted." She lowered the notebook. "Varlo?" "Outside." She looked at the wall she'd been measuring. "The foundation got its clearance 6 weeks ago. Preliminary. There are conditions." She turned back. "I'm going to use this building. The property reverted to county ownership, abandoned structures provision. The county is amenable to a long-term lease arrangement if the use is public benefit." He looked at the stone walls, at the door that someone had repaired and the path that someone had cleared, at the flat stones at the entrance. "Mountain rescue," he said. "Coordination point, volunteers, communication equipment, basic emergency supplies for the road." She looked at him steadily. "People get lost on this mountain. People break down. People make the wrong call about weather and end up on the side of the road in a storm." A pause. "Someone should stop." He looked at her. "Someone stopped for me," she said. Quiet. Without drama. Just the fact of it. He crossed the chapel in 3 steps, and he wasn't thinking about what came next or what it communicated or whether it was the right sequence of actions, because he'd spent 30 years calculating every move in terms of what it communicated and where it led, and he was done with that particular math. He stopped in front of her with the notebook and measuring tape still in her hands between them, and he looked at her face in the gray-green light that came through the chapel's stone windows. "The locket," he said. She reached up, unclasped it from her neck, and held it out. "I thought about this. Whether you should have it back." She paused. "It has your photographs." "It was given to you." "By someone connected to your father." "Yes." He looked at the locket in her palm. "I've been thinking about that." He had thought about it for 4 months in a room with an east-facing window. My father had a contact outside the organization, someone he trusted with the Renhold location, someone who knew what the exit was for and that it included his family. He paused. "I think he knew something might happen to him. I think he made arrangements for evidence and for people." She was very still. "He knew about your father," Damien said. "Mercer was investigating from the outside and my father knew it, and I think he made contact. I think they were moving toward the same thing from different directions." He looked at the locket. "My father made a copy of those photographs and put them somewhere he trusted, with instructions that said, 'If something happens, find the Mercer girl when she's old enough. Give her this. Let her find her way to what I built.'" Evelyn's hand closed around the locket. "He trusted my father," she said. "I think so. I think they trusted each other." He paused. "And then both of them were taken out before they could reach what they were building toward. And the locket sat with whoever held it for 30 years until your mother decided you were old enough and the time was..." whatever she decided the time was. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with the particular brightness of someone absorbing a thing that reorganizes everything they thought they knew about a long time ago. She knew, Evelyn said. My mother, she knew the whole time, and was frightened the whole time, and gave it to you anyway. She looked at the locket in her fist. She looked at the stone wall of the chapel, at the repaired door, at the flat stones at the entrance that she had put there herself on some previous visit that he hadn't been present for. She put the locket back around her neck. Keep it, he said. I was going to. She looked at him directly. I've been keeping things for a long time. I'm good at it. He almost smiled. It was not a thing his face did frequently, and it didn't go all the way to completion, but it was there, and she saw it, and something in her own face answered it. Outside, Varlo leaned against the car and looked at the mountains and drank from a thermos and did not look at the chapel door, which was the kind of courtesy that required no instruction and cost him nothing. The spring air moved through the open door. The stone walls of the chapel held the sound of it the way stone holds things, completely, without comment, for as long as required. The Viscari name, she said eventually. What happens to it? It ends with me. He said it without weight, which surprised him. He'd expected it to have weight, and it didn't. What it was built on is gone. What it protected is exposed. The name was always just the name. He looked at the door. My father understood that. He was trying to get past it. He paused. I'm past it. She turned the locket once on its chain. And you, she said, after the name. What's left? He thought about it honestly, the way he'd learned to think about questions in 4 months in a room with an east-facing window, with no organization to manage and no decisions to make, except the ones that were actually his. A man who stopped on a road, he said. That's what's left. She looked at him. It's enough, she said, and meant it. Amen. Months later, when the first real snow of the new winter came down off the peaks and onto the mountain road, the chapel at the side of the road had a light in it. Not electric. A work lamp running off a portable battery, the kind you used when you were measuring walls and making plans and needed to see what you were doing. The door was open and the light came out of it in a warm yellow column that reached the road and sat there in the dark. Damien came up the road on foot from where he'd left the car because the last quarter-mile was steep and the fresh snow made the grade better walked than driven. He had no particular plan for the evening. He had a thermos and a tolerance for cold that 30 years of winter mountains had built in him. And he had the particular freedom of a man who has set down everything he'd been carrying and not yet decided what to pick up next. He stood at the chapel door and looked in. Evelyn was at the far wall with the measuring tape, making a note in the notebook. She had her coat on and her hair pulled back and the locket outside her collar where she could see it, which was where she kept it now. She didn't hear him immediately. He stood in the doorway and watched her work. The focused efficiency of it, the way she moved through a space as though she already knew what it was going to be. And he thought about a boy standing in a doorway watching a man at a desk who didn't know he was there. And he thought about how some doorways you stood in without knowing what they meant and only understood later, after the room had changed and the man at the desk was gone and everything that came after had already come and gone. She looked up. She looked at him in the doorway with the work lamp between them and the snow outside in the dark behind him, and she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "You're letting the cold in." He stepped inside and closed the door. The chapel held the warmth of the lamp and the warmth of the work she'd been doing and the warmth of the particular kind of quiet that exists between two people who have been through the same storm and come out on the same side of it, and outside the mountain held the snow the way it always had. Completely, without comment, until spring came again and the road cleared and the world remembered that it was possible to move through the dark and arrive somewhere that deserved arriving at. The storm that had nearly claimed her life had buried an empire. What it left behind was smaller and quieter and entirely their own.